Welcome to this presentation on subject and verb agreement. I'm Justin Rempel. Today we're going to be talking about what subject and verb agreement means, why it's an important part of communication in the English language, and also how to do it properly, consistently, and well. So when we're talking about subject and verb agreement, we're talking about a couple different parts of a sentence. And a sentence is kind of the main unit of communication in the English language. It's one thought or idea that stands on its own. And when we're making a sentence in our writing, we want to be really focused on three main components. The first thing we want to do is to put a capital letter at the start. That tells us that we're beginning a new sentence. The second thing we want to do is make sure that we have all of an idea in the middle, that our words for our sentence form a complete thought or a complete idea. And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. The third and final thing we want to do is we want to put a period at the end of our sentence. This is just a piece of punctuation. It's a dot, and it comes at the end of our sentence to show us that the thought is done. It is finished. So I like to remember these three components with the acronym CAP, C-A-P, as in a hat that we wear. The C stands for capital letter at the start, A stands for all of an idea, and P stands for the period that comes at the end. So one of the most important concepts around forming a proper sentence in the English language is the concept of a complete idea. To have a complete idea, a full and proper sentence, we need at least two parts. The first thing we need is a noun, a thing that we're talking about. This is kind of like the topic of our sentence. We can call that thing the subject. The subject is the main thing that we're talking about in our complete idea. So for example, we could be talking about the sun. That could be the topic for our sentence. We can't just say the sun. That's not a full idea. That's just a word. It's not a complete idea yet. We also need to, bare minimum, at least have a verb, which is the action, the thing that the thing is doing. So we need to say something about the sun and what it's doing. The sun shines, okay? That's a complete idea. It's a very short idea, but that is considered a full sentence. We have a subject or a noun, which is the sun, and we have a verb, an action that it is doing. It is shining. The sun shines. Sometimes we use very simple actions like is or be to just indicate that something exists. The sun is bright today is just a way of describing what the sun is doing. It is existing, and we describe it as being bright or brilliant. So that too is a very simple sentence. But bare minimum, we need to have these two parts. We need to have a noun or a subject, and we need to have a verb. It's really important that our subject and our verb are in agreement with each other. That means that the same kind of subject and verb need to go together. And if you don't have the same kind of subject and verb together, it is grammatically incorrect. And this is a difficult and tricky skill for someone to learn, especially if they're just learning the English language, which is why we're having this conversation today about what subject-verb agreement is and how to do it. So the first thing we need to know when we're trying to make our subjects and our verbs agree with each other, that means we have the same kind, is this concept of singular and plural. Some nouns and verbs are singular, which means that they're just talking about one thing. And singular nouns and verbs need to go together. So if you have a singular noun, just talking about one thing, you need to have a singular verb that goes with that. Most English verbs that are singular have an S on the end. So here are some examples. The frog jumps. The plane flies. The student talks. In each of these sentences, we're just talking about one thing. Our subject is singular. We're talking about one frog. And when we describe its action, jumping, we have an S at the end. The frog jumps. We're just talking about one plane, that's our subject. And when we are talking about it flying, we have an S on the end. The plane flies. We're just talking about one student. And when we describe its action of speaking, we have an S at the end. The student talks. It would not be correct to say the frog jump, the plane fly, the student talk, because now we have a plural verb with a singular noun. Both the noun and the verb need to be singular, which means that the verb has an S at the end and the noun generally does not. Sometimes we're talking about plural nouns and verbs. That means they're talking about more than one thing. Plural nouns and verbs need to go together. When we have a plural noun or a plural subject of our sentence, we need a plural verb to go with it. And this is exactly the opposite of the pattern that we see with singular nouns and verbs. To make most English nouns plural, we add an S onto the end. And to make English verbs plural, we do not have an S on the end. So here are some examples. The frogs jump. The planes fly. The students talk. You can tell that the nouns or the subjects have S's on the end. The verbs do not. We're talking about more than one frog. Frogs, they jump. It's not the frogs jumps, it's the frogs jump. We're talking about multiple planes. They fly. It's not the planes flies, it's the planes fly. And we're talking about more than one student and they are talking. So we say the students talk, not the students talks. Some verbs use forms that do not follow the rules. They are called irregular verbs. This is an important chart that shows how the verb be, which means to exist, changes to agree with its subject. And this is looking at different pronouns, which are simple basic words that we use in place of nouns. When we are talking in the first person, we are talking about ourself or ourselves. And the singular version, just one of those, is when we use the word I or me to talk about myself. Well, one person, first person. So when we're doing that, we use these kinds of verbs. We say I was if we're talking about something in the past. We say I am if we're talking about an action in the present. And we say I will if we're talking about something in the future. Sometimes we're talking about ourselves as a group, so there's more than one, it's plural. And then we use pronouns like us and we. If we're talking in the past, we say we were doing something. If we're talking in the present, we say we are doing something. And if we're talking in the future, we say we will do something. Sometimes we talk in the second person, which means we're talking to someone else other than ourselves. We're writing to them or we're talking to them. And English does not have a difference between the singular or plural for the second person. In other words, when you're talking to someone else, it doesn't matter whether you're talking to just one person or a group. You always use the pronoun you. If we're talking in the past, we say you were doing something. If we're talking in the present, we say you are doing something. And if we're talking in the future, we say you will do something. Sometimes we talk in the third person, which means we're talking about someone else, but we're talking about them. They're not here. They're not present. We can use a variety of singular pronouns. She for a feminine pronoun, he for a masculine pronoun. It, they, or them can all be neutral pronouns. And those are all singular pronouns, which means we're talking about one person who is not present right now. We're talking about them with someone else. If we're talking about them in the past tense, we say she was doing something. If we're talking about them in the present tense, we say he is doing something. And if we're talking about them in the future tense, we say it will do something. If we're talking about more than one person in the third person, so a group who's not here, then we use the pronouns they or them. And notice that you can use they or them for singular, just one person, or a group, more than one person. If we're talking about that group in the past tense, we say they were doing something. If we're talking about them in the present tense, we say they are doing something. And if we're talking about them in the future tense, we say they will do something. So it's important to learn these things, and the only way to learn them is with practice, but this is part of making our verbs agree with our subjects. And the reason I use all these different forms of just the word be, meaning to exist, is because it's one of the most basic actions and one of the most basic helping verbs that we see in English. It works with a lot of other actions or words. So take the time to learn these patterns and how to use these words properly in agreement with each other. Compound subjects means that we're working with a sentence that has more than one subject. So sometimes sentences are talking about more than one thing. Often they are joined with a conjunction, which means a connecting word, and. And if that's the case, then we act as if it's a plural subject, in other words, more than one thing, and we use a plural verb. So here's our example. Betty and Rami make a pizza together. So here we're using a plural verb. It does not have an S at the end. Even though Betty is one person and Rami is one person, we're talking about them together, which means we have a compound subject, and we're kind of acting as if it's a plural because we're talking about two individuals. So if we were just talking about Betty, we'd say Betty makes a pizza, and that is a singular noun, Betty, with a singular verb, makes. Betty makes a pizza. But we're not. We're talking about both of them together. Betty and Rami are making a pizza together. They are making a pizza. It's a plural subject because there's more than one of them. Sometimes we use different conjunctions or connecting words like or nor. And if that's the case, you can use either a singular or plural verb, and you can base it off the noun closest to the verb. So here's an example. Either Wendy or Tristan wins the prize. Here we use the singular verb wins. It ends with an S because the noun closest to the verb is Tristan. And that's just a singular verb. That's just one person. However, here's a slightly different sentence. Either Wendy or her brothers win the prize. Here we've got a compound subject. And the second subject, the one that's closest to the verb, is a plural. It's the word brothers, which refers to more than one brother. So you can see that we're using a plural verb, win, without an S on the end. Either Wendy or her brothers win the prize. So when you're using these conjunctions or nor, use either a singular or plural verb based off the noun closest to the verb. Collective nouns. Sometimes we have nouns that are collective, which means they refer to a group of things. Some collective nouns are singular and agree with singular verbs. So for example, the word team is a noun. It refers to a group of people that are playing a game together, but it's just referring to one group. So we act as if it's a singular noun and we give it a singular verb. The team celebrates its victory. Here's another one, city. City can refer to a place, but it can also refer to all the people who live in that place. The city votes for its mayor tomorrow. That's referring to one group of people, singular subject, gets a singular verb, votes. The store closes. The government passes a new law. These are nouns that refer to a group of things or a group of people, and they're treated as a singular noun, and they get a singular verb. Some collective nouns are plural and agree with plural verbs. For example, the team members remember that season. Now we're talking about a bunch of different people, all the members on one team. That's a plural noun, and it gets a plural verb, remember, without an S on the end. Here's another one. The company executives plan on expanding. we're talking about multiple executives. It's a plural noun, and it gets a plural verb, plan without an S. The executives plan. Indefinite pronouns, which is a word used in place of a noun, and the indefinite part refers to the fact that they don't refer to a specific thing. They are singular, and they agree with a singular verb. So it's words like anybody or everyone, which is kind of general, broad, indefinite, doesn't refer to anything or anyone in particular. We treat these as singular nouns, and we give them singular verbs. Anybody is able to cook. Okay? So even though anybody could be a lot of different people, we're treating it in the sentence as if it's any one particular person, singular noun, gets a singular verb. Everyone wants one of those new video games. Everyone is a group. It's all people, but it's one group. So we treat it as a singular noun. It gets a singular verb, wants, ending with an S. Each of them runs the marathon separately. Each could be a few different people, but it's referring to one person at a time or one particular person. We treat it as a singular subject. It gets a singular verb, runs, with an S. Gerund is a noun that is based on a verb, and they usually end with the suffix ing. They usually function as singular nouns and agree with singular verbs. Here's an example. Hiking is one of my favorite activities. To hike is a verb, but we can change it into this form called a gerund, which is hiking. It's got that ing at the end. Now we're talking about a thing. We're talking about an activity that we can go out and do. It means walking in nature, through a forest, on a mountain, in a park, and that is a singular subject. So it gets a singular verb. Catching the football is difficult. To catch something is a verb, but here it's a noun. It's referring to the action of catching a ball. And we use a singular verb to agree with that singular noun. A couple other rules I want to point out when we talk about a pair in English. A pair is a singular noun, even though it's referring to two things. We're referring to them as one group together. And so it is a singular subject agreeing with a singular verb. So for example, that pair of jeans is old. We're talking about a pair of pants. It's one thing. It's one pair of pants, and it gets a singular verb. Subjects in school are usually singular nouns, even though they end with an S and look plural. They agree with a singular verb. So for example, mathematics is a fun subject for me. That's one subject, mathematics, and it gets a singular verb. They is a third-person pronoun. We mentioned this before. It can be singular or plural, but either way, if you're using the word they, use plural verb forms. So here's an example. I have a friend who is an expert chef. They bake an amazing cake. So here the word they is referring to one person, a friend, but notice that the verb is still plural, bake, even though we're just talking about one person. Here's another example. My friends like football and they play hard. Here the word they is referring to a group of people, your friends, and the verb is plural. So if you're using they or them, always use plural verb forms, whether or not you're referring to one person or a group of people.